Do you recognize the names Carnell Tate and Brandon Inniss? If you don't, stick around to find out more about them. If you do, still stick around because John Garcia Jr., Director of Football Recruiting at Sports Illustrated, is back, and he's going to help us learn all about these two wide receiver prospects and how likely it is that they commit to Ohio State. You can hear all that and more right here on Locked On Buckeyes.
You are Locked On Buckeyes, your daily podcast on the Ohio State Buckeyes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, Buckeye fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Buckeyes for the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jay Stevens, also the host of the Jay Stevens Podcast. It is Tuesday, May the 3rd in the year 2022, and I want to thank you for making Locked On Buckeyes your first listen of every single day. John Garcia Jr. is back. He's phenomenal. He is full of knowledge, full of information about future players that will be playing in college football, but specifically those that might be playing in the shoe today. We'll go over and talk about players such as Carnell Tate, Brandon Inniss, Hakeem Williams, and Noah Rogers, a likelihood and possibility of them being Buckeyes in the future. And joining us now here on Locked On Buckeyes, it is John Garcia Jr., the Director of Football Recruiting at Sports Illustrated, back with us again. John, this is 3 weeks in a row, man. We might keep this train rolling and allow fans to get more insight on future Buckeyes.
There's always plenty to talk about for the Ohio State fan base. I mean, they recruit so nationally and so darn well, let's be honest, that there's always something to dig into, man. So happy to do it.
I'm happy you're back, and we got two guys today, primarily two guys I'm going to hit on, may hit on some others that are wide receivers that Ohio State, that might commit to Ohio State. One recently announced his dates for his official visit to Ohio State. We'll touch on him first, and another one's from IMG Academy, a factory down there in Bradenton, Florida. First one, Brandon Inniss, five-star recruit, according to 247, their composite rankings, out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, down in South Florida down there. What are some things you like about this young man when you see him play football?
Man, Brandon Inniss is just so developed and polished. I mean, he really has a mature game in terms of just how he attacks a defensive back, whether it's from a leverage standpoint or from a physicality standpoint or just from a speed standpoint. He can just run by most defensive backs. But really, he's just had a mature frame and build and demeanor since he was a freshman or a sophomore recruit. And I think that's why he has, 40 scholarship offers to his name. There's just a really high floor with this kid. You know, he can win short and make guys miss and go the distance, or he could win at the catch point, despite being, 6 foot, 6'1", maybe, he really can bounce and get up and play balls at the apex. So he just brings a total skill set to the position. He can run every route on the route tree with polish and with a plan, with an understanding of how do I get this defensive back to open his hips so that I can go the other way, which is really something we don't talk enough about in the evaluation business. We fall in love with long and speedy guys, but there's a lot to be said for guys who are more compact, well-built, like Brandon Inniss, 6'1", 190 or so, and he's just got a total skill set to come in and play the slot or outside, basically from day one. I think when you talk about the wide receiver position in this class, it's a strong one, Inniss might have the highest floor of that entire group, and that's something that obviously Brian Hartline covets. There's a lot of young players at that position that have come in and flourished at Ohio State, so no surprise to see him as a priority target.
We talked a lot last week about versatility, sometime when you were on, about versatility that Brian Hartline likes. But some of the things you're saying about this young man, the way he's able to have a plan while running a route, how he's able to get the corner to open his hips so Brandon can get to where he wants to go to catch the ball. The only word that comes to my mind, John, when I hear what you're saying is rare. I don't really hear much about these traits that a lot of high school receivers have. And I'm curious, man, you said, has he been like this since, I guess, freshman year, being able to be as polished as he sounds?
He has. I think that's why he blew up so quickly. He was at a school that wasn't as popular as where he is now at American Heritage. But man, he was just dominating great defensive backs in South Florida. And then he started to do it outside of Friday nights as well, 7-on-7 circuits, camps, combines. No matter where you watched Brandon Inniss run routes and play football, he was borderline dominant going back to being 14, 15 years old. And that's just not something we see at that position. That is such a physical position, right? Where we're talking speed, size, body control, balance, a plan, maturity, all these things that are hard to knock, to check all those boxes, I should say, with a high school kid. He's really had that since his freshman, sophomore year, and has only built upon that since, to where now he's 190 pounds and he looks physically like he already plays college football, and he's preparing more for Sundays than Saturdays. So I think all that whole combination of a high floor, polished route runner, physical presence, and now physically built really just makes him just what feels like a safe bet, because we've just seen him dominate literally across the country and on Friday nights against some of the best competition in the country. So it's one of those things where you see it so many times that you have to believe it at some point.
What kind of competition does he get? Does he play against on Fridays down there in Fort Lauderdale?
Yeah, well, American Heritage High School and Plantation play some of the best schools in the country. I mean, they opened up with IMG Academy last year. And so Inniss is going against, multiple Power 5 players. I believe Dalen Everett covered him for most of the game. He signed with Georgia. I mean, so they right off the bat are playing a national scale. And then even when they localize it in the Broward County area, you're talking about St. Thomas Aquinas, Cardinal Gibbons, Plantation High School is kind of their crosstown rival. I mean, there's a lot of Saturday and Sunday talent that patrols through that county in particular. So it's really a week in, week out kind of deal. And then obviously when you hit the playoffs at a school like that, you take it across the state, and they're playing Trinity Christian from up in Jacksonville. They've played great Tampa teams as well. And they'll venture into Orlando this year. So it's really a statewide schedule with national level competition if you get into the individual player.
And I remember seeing something on Twitter. I forget the exact dates, but I believe that he recently announced his official visit dates for Ohio State. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, it looks like the third week of June he'll be on campus. The only two visits that have been set to this point are Alabama that first weekend of June, and then Ohio State a couple weeks later. So June's going to be really important for the recruitment of Brandon Inniss. Many people, including myself, view Alabama and Ohio State as two of the primary competitors for this kid's commitment. I think USC is going to be involved here to a large degree. He was an Oklahoma commitment when Lincoln Riley was in Norman. So naturally, he obviously trusts that system and what they can do at the wide receiver position. So really those three schools to me are going to be the primary contenders when it comes to Inniss. And obviously they're all very far away from South Florida. So those visits are going to play critical in his decision-making process. And you could really, Jay, you could start to begin the breakdown for each school and kind of sell it and win that argument, right? With USC, you're like, developmental, he trusts them. There's a track record there between him and that coaching staff. Now it's at USC on a grand scale, which is something that he can compete with immediately. Boom, you can make that sell. At Ohio State, it's like Brian Hartline. Look at the production. Look at what we just saw in the NFL draft. They've had so much success in South Florida. Even his teammate, Mark Fletcher, is verbally committed to Ohio State right at this moment. And there are other OSU targets on that American Heritage roster. And then you go to Bama, very similar to Ohio State, right? Wide receiver production, Nick Saban, consistency, stability, the ability to win on Saturdays, getting into Sunday. I mean, it's really nitty gritty between some of these options. So you could really start to build that argument for either of those three schools. But other schools are trying to stay in it too. I don't want to undersell the in-state schools trying to keep him home. Miami, Florida, and Florida State all hosted him earlier this spring. And then some other schools are trying to stay in the game there as well. Oregon, Clemson have been brought up at different points in his recruitment. So it's certainly seemingly far from over, but these official visits are tangible milestones and markers to begin to track and say, okay, of these 12 schools, let's say, who is really emerging for Brandon Inniss? And I think no matter who you ask, especially down here in Florida, Ohio State's going to come up quickly, Bama's going to come up quickly, and so is USC. So really, for me, the ball starts in those three schools' court.
John, it sounds really weird. It feels weird for me to be saying this now. I know where we are right now in 2022. I know how things have changed monetarily for these young men. But I feel very weird saying it might turn into a bidding war. I almost feel like we are in a world that nobody thought would ever be legal, like a legal bidding war, not
Right,
like the things that are going on under the
right.
table. These schools are legally finding ways to pay these kids or to get these kids to commit to schools with money involved in this stuff. It feels I'm 33 years old. I don't mind saying the age. I'm young. I know what's going on behind the scenes. But now that it's legalized, you see how much money these boosters or an attorney or these companies are willing to just dump into these 18-year-old kids' laps. It feels weird, man.
Yeah, and we've seen it really all over the country, right? I mean, there's an elephant in the room deal for a quarterback from California where you're talking $8 million before he ever takes a college snap. We've seen basketball players transfer and sign deals for near $1 million for really what's going to be 1 year of service at the end of the day down at Miami with the K-State transfer. So, and these are just the public ones, right? I mean, we know Ohio State, Alabama, Texas A&M, my goodness, USC. We know these schools have major players, huge alumni bases with businesses and means across the country and in most cases beyond the country's lines as well. So it's really a slippery slope. I talked to a Big Ten assistant this morning who said, man, this is a mess, Garcia. Like, he was just like breathing a sigh of relief and frustration at the same time. Like, this is a mess. How do you deal with this? There's really no one way to go about it that makes sense. So what that does in terms of what we do in the recruiting game, how do you project where a kid's going to end up? Well, the visits certainly tell a story, but obviously it's not the whole story. But it is why it's important, for these official visits to get set up, because it allows for more time for the kid to get familiar with a place where he might be living for 3+ years. But there's no doubt, Jay, like you said, it is a legal bidding war in a lot of cases. And if there's a wide receiver or two that might be worth that type of, inquiry is the word I'll say. Brandon Inniss is one of them. He's one of the best. And like we talked about, we've known about him. Everyone's known about him for 2, 3, 4 years at this point. So you can imagine what type of buildup and resources have already been put into him from a time perspective from some of these coaches. So when it comes to the other side of that coin, you do know that they want to make sure they stay in the hunt and have a chance to land this kid.
It came to my mind because you mentioned USC, Lincoln Riley. I believe it's the wide receiver from Pitt, who is rumored or was rumored before being in the portal to be going to USC. Money's on the table there. I don't know all the ins and outs, all the details about that situation, so I won't dive into that. But it's weird. That's the first thing that came to my mind when I hear USC we record this on May 2nd. I think money, and I don't want to think that. But I do understand that money is going to be involved in legally finding ways to get these kids money might help your school. How likely do you think it is that Brandon Inniss commits to Ohio State?
I think it's pretty likely. We mentioned when we were kind of crafting the arguments for each of these schools, the Ohio State angle is strong. I think without factoring in NIL, because look, there's no way to quantify it, right? Which school brings in more money? There's really no way to do that. So removing that for our purposes, you think of his position. He is a wide receiver. He has a great mature skill set built for playing early on at the collegiate level, something Ohio State has produced on a very consistent basis, really for the long stretch of time, but even more recently in the time where a kid like Brandon Inniss is watching college football, Ohio State has kind of been that school. If there's a counter to that, maybe Alabama has challenged that wide receiver you thrown of late of Ohio State. But look, the draft was another kind of feather in the cap for Brian Hartline and company. And when you're talking about a kid who's well-versed in recruiting, who's kind of heard it all and seen it all, it becomes, to me, about the tangible. What have you tangibly done at my position? Because when you talk to kids outside of NIL, and in most cases, really kids don't bring it up. They don't if we don't understand it, you think they understand it?
Right.
They really don't. They bring up Sundays. It's no longer about, hey, I want to start something new. I want to develop. I want to win games on Saturdays. All that stuff's great, and it comes up. But really, it's about Sundays. Which college affords me that vehicle from Fridays to Sundays? And Ohio State at that position has as much say as any school in the country. And then you factor in the relationship with Hartline, which is a long-standing one already. And then you start to factor in the success the Buckeyes have had in South Florida. And there's precedent, right? Recruiting is like law. If there is precedent watch out. And Ohio State in South Florida, I mean, in Broward County alone, you're talking about the Bosa brothers. Last year, Kenyatta Jackson. We just mentioned Mark Fletcher's verbally committed. This is in one county in South Florida, and Fletcher's a teammate of his. American Heritage kids know about Ohio State. It's just part of it at this point. So you can really craft that argument. I think Ohio State, if I had to rank the schools, I think they've got a slight edge over Alabama. And then USC might be third in this conversation today. And I think depending on when you talk about it, it shifts. But he's going to visit those two schools. Those are the only two officials set right now. And to me, that's another indicator. It's really an Ohio State-Bama situation with USC waiting in the wings thereafter.
Another kid, another young man. I think we talked about it last week. I remember you saying something about Carnell Tate here on the show. Carnell Tate, IMG Academy. He started out in Chicago. He's down in Bradenton, Florida. Not far. I think you're in Tampa, so Bradenton is not too far from where you currently live. But what can you tell us about Carnell Tate, some things you like about him being a young wide receiver prospect?
Yeah, there's some similarities to Inniss just in terms of the maturity of how he attacks a defensive back. Carnell is a little bit more smooth. Where we talk about Inniss being such a physical guy, stopping, getting his, chicken wing in there, pushing off of a plant leg, things like that. I think with Carnell, it's a little smoother. He's taller, he's longer. It's got a little bit more finesse in his game, and that's okay at the wide receiver position. Think of Chris Olave versus Jackson Smith and Jigba, right? Two guys that get the job done. It just kind of looks differently when they do it, and I think that's the case with Tate. He's about 6'2", 180 pounds. Really understands the foundation of route running. Not a blow off the top of the defense type of speed guy, but because he's long and understands how to run routes, he can create downfield separation. But where Carnell really breads his butter is in an intermediate game. You're talking deep digs, deep comebacks, deep outs, the routes that really flip a defensive back's hips because you're breaking down and gearing down underneath. That's where Carnell Tate really shines. He's got excellent ball skills, body control, knows how to extend and maximize that catch radius, and he's got some bounce to his game as well. I mean, IMG had no issues, lobbing him up a ball in the end zone, and really it was the game against Brandon Inniss and American Heritage that I was at in August of 21, where I was like, who is this Carnell Tate guy? Because he was the best offensive player on the field, including Inniss, including Mark Fletcher, including all the other weapons IMG has. As a junior, Carnell Tate was the best offensive player when IMG played American Heritage. And he was a great punt returner. He showed vision and instincts that you wouldn't expect for a kid at 6'2", 180 pounds or so. Usually it's the 5'9", 5'10" guy that's known for quickness. Carnell is none of those things, but yet has success in the return game. So it gives you some after the catch ability that's intriguing as well. So he's got another skill set that has been known for quite some time, similar to Inniss, with a similar list of suitors. And I think they're developing a friendship too. They play on the same 7-on-7 team. So it's getting kind of interesting between the two. Most people think they don't end up at the same school because they both are sort of alphas, but they have developed a friendship at the same time playing for South Florida Express on the 7-on-7 circuit. And they even visited Ohio State together recently a couple weeks ago. So really interesting there, but they are very different in terms of what makes them tick and what makes them such a coveted recruit. But obviously Ohio State, all these schools would love to have one or both if at all possible.
Hey, John, I don't think it's any problem with having two alpha receivers on the team together. Yeah, it may be a nightmare for the quarterback because there's only one ball and two guys that want it. But at the same time, it's, hey, give me the ball. I'm going to get open. And then once the ball goes their way, they're going to realize I have to attack and take advantage of this opportunity because if I drop this ball, I might not get it again.
Yeah, I mean, we just saw it at Ohio State, right, where their room was so loaded that the guy who transfers out, it becomes the number one receiver at Alabama. I mean, what scenario does that make sense? If you said it 5 years ago, like, oh yeah, the guy who's number 4 is going to go to Bama and like change the whole trajectory of that offense. You're like, no, that doesn't make sense. I mean, that's how stacked the Ohio State wide receiver room is. Brian Hartline is used to dealing with wide receiver egos, which are a thing. We shouldn't ignore that. He's used to managing that in a very positive way. You talk to people at OSU, there was no love lost. The love was maintained with Jameson Williams. I mean, even in the draft, they mentioned that he went back to Columbus on the bye week from Alabama. So Uh, a guy who can manage that type of personality and those different types of receivers all in one way becomes really intriguing if they sit down and they're having lunch on a bus on the way to a 7-on-7 game and they say, you know what, man, let's play together. Something like that happens. There's no doubt that Ohio State is the school because they really don't overlap elsewhere in terms of the contenders. Because we mentioned with Inniss, it's Ohio State, Bama, USC, maybe sprinkle in an Oregon. With Carnell Tate, it's Ohio State, Tennessee, Notre Dame, LSU. So there's really no other overlap other than Ohio State. And again, they've already visited that program together. So if a package deal comes out of nowhere, Buckeye fans should get really excited about the future of the receiver room because all of that tradition and Saturday and Sunday pipeline stuff, that's going to roll on with these two.
We asked you a question about Brandon Inniss. Went a little bit longer with him, but the NIL thing was it's still baffling to me. Still weird that we're saying this now that it's a legal bidding war. Those words I never thought would come out of my mouth. But how likely do you think it is that Carnell Tate commits to Ohio State?
I think this one's a little harder to peg, to be honest. I think with Tate, you have the three clear contenders, and Ohio State and Bama feel like they're at the top or near the top. With Tate, it kind of has fluctuated. I think last fall, Notre Dame was probably in the driver's seat. Obviously, coaching change there. Now LSU is in the conversation. So obviously, Carnell, big fan of Brian Kelly. But in between those trajectory changes, Ohio State was always kind of the foundational school with Carnell, always the school that was right there. I think he tweeted something about when he was in middle school or elementary even about what his football life looks like. And at that point, he said, yeah, I'm going to go to Ohio State. So this is the childhood dream school. It's the regional power. Obviously, you mentioned he's a Chicago kid who's now at IMG Academy. But all of a sudden, Tennessee's had him on campus, and they start to feel really good about his recruiting process at this point. I talked to a source in Tennessee today that feels like Tennessee is contending most consistently with LSU, and Ohio State could be third or fourth with Notre Dame thereafter. So it really becomes a battle of, the Midwestern roots versus the SEC experience that he's been having here recently, having visited both Tennessee and LSU officially to this point. So Inniss is planning the officials. Tate has already taken two, and the two schools that received those visits were LSU and Tennessee. So naturally, they do have a little bit more momentum in his recruitment. And there's a thought that Carnell might be a little closer to making a commitment compared to Inniss, who's probably going to take it into the fall, maybe even all the way to December. So if you're a Buckeye fan, you're hoping that Carnell waits a little bit relative to Inniss, where you're like, hey, we're in the game all the way through regardless. So I do think the SEC footprint is pulling Tate a little bit more than Inniss at this moment.
Hope you're wrong. Hope you're wrong about the South, but I do think Ohio State fans would love. I've seen a lot of them on Twitter and different things, conversations they've had. They've all loved the possibility of getting Tate in Columbus. So I hope it's right. I hope it happens. Not only because he's talented, but also because I know fans would love to be happy, and I would love fans to be happy as well. Who are some other guys in this class, 2023 recruits, that might join the recruiting class that Ohio State currently has?
Yeah, well, we certainly have talked about the top two guys. Let me throw another South Floridian into the conversation. Hakeem Williams, big basketball player, 6'4", 6'5", who also plays on that South Florida Express 7-on-7 team, who also plays in Broward County, the same county as Brandon Inniss. He's one that has been linked to Ohio State at various points during his sort of rise. He's not Carnell and Brandon in the aspect of we've known about him for such a long time. Hakeem has really blown up in the last 12 to 18 months. And Ohio State is one of those offers that has kind of validated that ascent. So Ohio State is one that is hoping to get him back on campus. He did visit when the 7-on-7 team was in town a couple weeks ago. So you wonder if he sets up an official visit to OSU. Right now, the only official that I'm aware of him taking or setting up, I should say, is to Pitt, to bring it full circle with the Jordan Addison stuff. He will visit Pitt and see what they have to offer. Miami is in it, the local school for him as well, but so is Ohio State. So I think if I'm a Buckeye fan, I'm keeping an eye on those prospects at this point. I do think, we've seen Noah Rogers show a lot of attention towards Ohio State. He's a kid out of North Carolina, big physical target, similar to Akeem Williams. I think Akeem goes 6'3", 6'4". Noah Rogers 6'2", 6'3". Again, both of them big, close to that 200-pound range or so. So it brings you a more of a possession element. Rogers has some of the best ball skills and hands that I've scouted in person so far in this 2023 cycle. So I think Clemson's a major player for him. You know, he is a Carolina kid and up in North Carolina. So you wonder about that pull and that kind of legacy of big receivers that have thrived at Clemson. But Ohio State is in that conversation as well as a couple other schools. So I think he's another big body to keep an eye on. But either way, I mean, this receiver core has a good foundation, of course, with Bryson Rogers already verbally committed. The tight end is already on board as well with the Lockwood kid out of Texas or Tennessee, excuse me. So, you know, this class is shaping up to be another strong one from a pass catcher perspective. But I'd keep an eye on Williams and Rogers, especially relative to Tate and Inniss if they start to come off the board or schools other than OSU start to build momentum with those guys. I'd keep an eye on the other two.
John, this has been fun, but it's always fun having you on. If you could let everybody know it, they can catch you on Twitter. If they're not watching on YouTube, maybe they don't know your Twitter handle just yet. There may be some things. If there's anything special going on at Sports Illustrated, feel free to say that as well.
Yeah, well, right now we're just trying to track the quarterback dominoes. Really, that's the big question. I know we talked about it at length last week, Jay. That's what we're really tracking right now. Jaden Rashada, Arch Manning, of course, Eli Holstein and company down south. But yeah, all that can be found for free at si.com/college. And my Twitter handle is John Garcia _JR.
And guys, you can follow me on Twitter at jsteven07. I told you a couple weeks ago, this will not be the final time that John comes on. I said it back then. I'll say it now. Might be weekly. I don't know. It just happened to be I had some free time to get him on the show again this week. John, it's always fun having you on, and you bring a great insight to Ohio State fans and Buckeyes, players that might be Buckeyes in the future. Thanks, John, for coming back on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, boss. Take care.